So this has been another one of our Temple Israel adventures this morning. That's the way that I like to look at it, you know. You take a global pandemic, you add a nice retro old-fashioned storm, and we still have shul, which means a lot, you know. I don't want to in any way understate how important it is for us to just keep coming together and to keep reading from our Torah and to keep praying and to keep engaging. It is really, in so many ways, what we stand for as a people, which is that we keep going. And this morning, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes just to reflect on the whole notion of how deeply do we get into the rationale, the meaning, the why, the larger story for why it is that we do what we do. Anybody who has raised or who has come into extensive contact with younger children knows that one of the questions that children ask over and over again is a question that begins with the word why. So why do I have to go to bed now? Why can't we see God? Why do I have to do what you're telling me to do? Why is the sky blue? Why is the beginning of questions which suggest an endemic curiosity that children have? And I would argue that if we allow children to continue to ask those questions and we respond, then they become curious adults, which is a good thing, because inside of each adult, hopefully, is a curious child, and the child is potentially a curious adult. So this takes us to the very beginning of this morning's parasha, which is when God says to Moses, "Ve'ela Mishpatim asher tasim lifnehem." These are the statutes, the laws that you're supposed to lay out before the people. And Rashi has a beautiful interpretation about this. Rashi says Moses was being told to lay it out like you would lay out a table, like set the table, shulchan aruch. This is what you need to do with the traditions, meaning what? God says to Moses, look, you might think it's enough to just keep repeating the same thing over and over again. Just say it and say it and say it. It's not enough. You have to give ta'am la mitzvot. You have to give the rationale, the meaning, the overarching story behind all of the traditions. Otherwise, it's no use. Otherwise, children and adults are going to pull away. They're not going to take it to heart. They're not going to make it part of who they are. So I want to reflect a little bit this morning on how important it is for us with our children, with the next generation, but also with people as they get older, to not be afraid to talk about what this means, to not be afraid to talk about the ta'am. There's a little bit of a resistance to that. It's easier to say this is just what we do, don't ask questions. And sometimes if we don't have the answers for the why, we should seek out those answers. And we should do what we need to do to be able to engage so that people don't see this as something that they're simply being forced to do. There's also a concern that if you give the reasons, then people at all ages will say, well, I don't like those reasons, or those reasons don't make sense. For example, if we say the reasons why we keep kosher have entirely to do with health benefits, that the animals that are prohibited are healthier than, are less healthy than the animals that are not prohibited, well, people grow up and they say, hey, I looked online, and it seems to me that some of the animals that we're allowed to eat are actually no healthier than the ones that were not. So you can give reasons and it can backfire. Nevertheless, overall, I would argue that our rabbinic leaders, and I among them, believe that it's better to give rationale. I want to give an example and then reflect on something very contemporary, and then I'll conclude. So here's the example. So in the parasha, you go a little bit further, and you see that there are laws about how we're supposed to protect almana v'yatom, so the widow and the orphan. So the Torah says, Kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun. You're not supposed to afflict, oppress the widow and the orphan. Im ane ta'ane oto, ki im tza'ok yitz'ak elai shamoa eshma tza'akato. So if you afflict them, if they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. Okay, so that's the first thing. God says, I'll hear them if they cry out. Now, it goes on to a different law. You lend money to somebody, and you are not supposed to take as credit their garment overnight, because the person will be cold overnight. So what does God say? God says, Hi ksuto levada, hi simlato le'oro b'meishkav v'haya ki yitz'ak elai v'shamati ki chanun ani. It's his only garment. It's his only covering. If he cries out to me, I will hear him, because I am chanun. I am compassionate. So the hearing is interesting. God says, no, I'll hear the widow. I'll hear the orphan. I'll hear the cold person at night whose garment you took away. And if you think back, that vishamati, I will hear, is what God said to the children of Israel when they were enslaved. V'gam ani shamati et na'akat b'nei Israel. I heard the crying out of our people. Now, why is this important? Because that suggests a larger story. That suggests a larger why. So much, not all, but so much of our tradition is based on trying to establish good hearing. We say that God hears. God hears those whose voices might be quiet. God hears the voices of those who have been subjugated, and therefore we need to do the same thing. So when we are speaking to children when they are young, or as they get older, or to peers, or to each other, it is important for us, just as one possibility, to mention that the larger why, the larger story, has to do with hearing. It has to do with how carefully we are listening to the voices that surround us, some of which we might be tempted to ignore. If God hears, we need to hear as well. And now I want to get to the more contemporary. So a few days ago, we commemorated Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is a day that was established not more than 20 years ago by the United Nations. And some would say, Schoen Zeit, it was about time that the United Nations recognized that it was important to establish a day for remembering the Holocaust. Of course, Jewish people have been commemorating Yom HaShoah for decades. And the commemoration, the recognition, the remembering is, I would argue, also about hearing. It is also about continuing to hear the stories of those who experienced in their lives that which no human being should experience. And if we would imagine to ourselves, how could you possibly forget? Well, we see it's easy to forget. It's easy to forget. It's easy to deny. And so it's important. Shmi'ah, hearing, is a big part of the why, recognizing that a story that is experienced by a human being is worthy of being recalled, especially when that story is about a travesty that human beings have committed, and when that story is also about the remarkable integrity and strength that other human beings have demonstrated. And that shmi'ah, that hearing, is, of course, directed towards the survivors of the Shoah, but that hearing also needs to be applied to any human being who is going to be the object of the kind of hatred that was allowed to smolder and fester and to overtake an entire society and beyond. That hearing needs to continue to be acute on all of our parts. We need to continue to listen for stories that are emerging, hopefully before the tragedy, hopefully before the travesty overtakes an entire people. So when children ask us, why this, why that, we need to recognize that our tradition has the answer to that. There are many whys, but one why, which connects a lot of the dots, is that we need to train ourselves to listen, that we believe that our Creator listens. We believe that a human story matters. We believe that human suffering matters. We believe that a human being who is able to overcome suffering needs to be heard. We believe that we need to continue the way that we say that God listens, to listen to each other, and hopefully everything that we do is in response to our careful listening, and that helps one law at a time, one tradition at a time, to set a table that has positive benefits for everybody. Shabbat Shalom.